And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about how to fix political fatigue. How to fix political fatigue. Here we are in the year 2024. We are staring down another presidential election, and it's kind of like Christmas, as we've joked before in the podcast, that elections just seem to be coming earlier and earlier each year, or maybe looking at it a different way, it just seems like they never stop. And our political rhetoric continues to escalate, and we're looking at a Trump versus Biden rematch. And I've had many people share with me that, how did we come to this place again? And we know that there's going to be anger. We know there's going to be vitriol. There's going to be, this is the most important election in our lifetime again. And I do think every election is important, and this one's going to be a very important one. So I don't want to downplay any of that. But I think the general mood among Americans is, oh boy, here we go again. We're going to be spending millions and millions of dollars collectively as a nation on this process, and it's going to be hard. The world's going to be watching us, and certainly for church leaders as we head into 2024. We've talked about preparing your church for this election season. As I talk to pastors, many of them are nervous about how things are going to go. We want to teach our people to engage biblically in their role as citizen, but we know that there's going to be a lot of information out there that's going to be fear-based. There probably going to be broken relationships, and if 24 is like 2020, maybe people will even be leaving churches, breaking long-term friendships over politics. So I'd say all of that, I think that's the general mood. And maybe where you are, everyone is just pumped and excited that it is another election year, but that's just not the sense that I'm getting from a lot of people that aren't involved on a day-to-day basis in politics or in governance. And I think this is also borne out through some studies. And this is from 2023. There was a study that said 65% of Americans, when asked about politics, says that they're feeling exhausted. And then another 55% said when they think about politics, they just get angry. And only 10% said they're hopefully, and only 4% are excited. What's wrong with those people? What's wrong with the 4%? They're excited about this whole thing. No, there are people that do this for a living and are excited about it. I certainly enjoy the aspects of governance, not so much just the yelling back and forth about political campaigning, but about 4% said that they were excited. So what are we going to do about fatigue over politics? And this is true not just for just the average American citizen, but certainly for us as Christian citizens. That's the target audience of this podcast. And how do you, each year, every 2 years, we have congressional elections, and often state rep elections, every 4, probably a governor, as well as the president. And, so these things are always here. And so how do you maintain this role as citizen to do it to the best of your ability, to not just get completely burned out on it? And so I have a thesis, I have a thought, and I want to maybe take some time to kind of roll this out. My thought is that Americans are fatigued by political information, not political involvement. So again, we are fatigued, we're exhausted by political information and not political involvement. And some of you are thinking, well, I've been involved. So just a second. Only 2/3 of registered voters showed up for the 2020 election. And that was one of the best attended, most involvement in a nationwide election in a long time. Approximately 161 Americans are registered to vote. That's out of 331, almost 332 million at this point. Now, certainly you have part of the population that isn't old enough to vote, but still, that's a significant part of the American population that isn't even registered. And only 37%, this is based on Pew Research, only 37% of Americans voted in all 3 elections of 2018, 2020, and 2022. And then you just think about the day-to-day aspects of governance with 150 legislators here in Indiana, here every day at the State House. There's actually a very small percentage of people that can take off work and come up here. Then you think of Washington, D.C., largely the same. And so we do have kind of a political class that is tasked, we've delegated as the American people, we've delegated the task of governance to a particular class of people that are involved, that get elected, that sort of thing. But still, the numbers don't carry over this thought of, all right, we are all just so exhausted by every day we're coming in here and worrying about fixing the potholes and voting on legislation. Um, so I think the fatigue comes more from political information rather than political involvement, in the sense that we are inundated with news articles. Social media certainly hasn't helped, where we're just doom scrolling and we see all of the horrible things that are going on. And so, if that's true, if we're fatigued primarily by political information and not political involvement, how do we fix this? How do we address this? If we as American Christian citizens are over the long haul going to do this faithfully, we're going to do this strategically. If we believe that as Christians, we're called to follow Jesus in every area of our lives, including our role as citizen, and we're going to live that out well, how are we going to do this? Because if we just get so fatigued, so burned out all the time, we just don't have the interest to do it right. That's a problem. So this is certainly an issue for the republic as a whole, and the principles I'm going to share would be true for really any individual, but it's specifically true for a Christian citizen. So I want to give you kind of 5 things to think through on how to fix political fatigue. We'll go through these pretty quickly. The first one, I would say, again, if my thesis is correct, that we are fatigued by political information and not political involvement, I would say, first of all, well, then control political information. Okay. So it strikes me that in the church, we have taken a lot of steps to try to protect people's eyes. We think of Covenant Eyes, Accountable to You, other apps and filters. We take, as parents should, we take measures to protect our children from accessing pornography and other sources on the internet. In fact, there's legislation being moved in several places around the country trying to prevent children from accessing adult content through the use of verification of data, information verification, say a driver's license, that sort of thing. And so we are, as a society, are taking a lot of steps to protect our eyes, but do we take similar steps to protect our souls? And I mean this in the sense that sociologist has said, and I think this is true of how God designed us, has created us, is that the human soul, our soul, is village-sized, and that we can really care well for maybe 150 to 200 people. And that's kind of carries over into about the number of relationships that one human being can effectively manage. Maybe you're really high performing, and that's not true. But generally, that our souls are village sized. And we talk about this quite a bit with social media and the next generation. But when you begin to scroll through and see the problems and the tragedies, the burdens of all mankind, all when you just woke up, you haven't even had a cup of coffee yet, and you're doom scrolling, and of course, our news sources want to get likes and clicks, so they're not going to sell you a nice story about people being kind to one another and everything's just fine and you can go back to your work. It's all good. No, that's not the business model, right? We all know that. And so, do we take time to even protect our souls? So, do we control the amount of political information that we're taking in on a daily basis? And I tell you, I can be an offender in this sense too, of just sitting here trying to understand what's going on around the country, making sure I'm informed. That's part of my job. And at some days it's too much. It's just too much. And you leave that thinking, wow, the world's falling apart. It affects your trust in God. It affects your peace of mind. And so trying to balance that. So how do we control political information? The idea is to stay informed, without weighing down your soul with things that God didn't design you to carry. So a couple thoughts here is certainly to stay informed, but to control political information. I'm sure you probably have, if you've thought through this, you have a system. Maybe your system's better than mine, but just to give you an example, on a good day, if I'm doing this properly, I want to stay informed of what's going on at the national, state, and local level. And so I'll start generally nationally. Maybe I should flip that and start locally, but generally it's just easier. And so I want to take a news source that I know is going to be more progressive. And then I want to take a news source that I know is going to be more conservative. And so I want to see how different news organizations are framing what's going on. And at this point, if you've been following the podcast, you're a follower of Jesus. I believe that you have the wisdom to know, all right, this is how this organization is going to slant this, how this organization is going to slant it, because they're speaking to a particular audience. I've also found a news site like World Opinion is a particular one. There are other kind of Christian news organizations that are working to try to bring a little bit more just here's the news rather than doing a good bit of commentary on it. So I've actually written for World Opinions, and certainly it's going to be a more conservative publication, but that would be another one where they're trying to bring the news and just say here's what's going on with some opinions. So again, a little bit more progressive, a little more conservative and non-religious, and World Opinions is going to be a bit more religious and conservative. There's also a podcast called The Pour Over and others that will kind of curate the news and try to bring it to you. So that would be nationally. At the state level, we have a newspaper called the Indy Star, which is going to be more progressive, a newspaper called the Indiana Business Journal, which is going to be a bit more conservative, perhaps not so much conservative, but perhaps not as progressive as the Star. And again, these are just my opinions as I'm looking at those. But I want to be able to see kind of what is the news, how are these big stories being framed, and then I want to take a look at local news and just see what's happening in my zip code. Think, well, that's a lot, but actually, all of that can be done pretty quickly, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. If you're not going down a rabbit hole, you can get a general gist of what's going on in the world in that period of time, and just set a time limit and say, hey, this is all I'm going to do. And now I know I'm informed. The world hasn't exploded. I'm informed enough that I can have a conversation with other people rather than just doom scrolling and going down rabbit holes and getting so distracted by all the news. Also, you can certainly use a news curation website like Google News or others to pick. Certainly, Apple has a similar program where you can just curate all of that. So you kind of see it in a feed and you spend some time. So I will tell you, I don't always do a great job of this. And I've just been reminded as we head into 24, I need to, just as I need to protect my eyes, I also need to protect my soul. And we can be wise as serpents, gentle as doves here. We know how this works, don't we? We all know how this works. And yet we still get pulled in. We know that it's infotainment. We know that fear, we know that anger sells. And this is nothing new. I've been listening a little bit to the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and certainly leading up to the American kind of Spanish War. There was this thing they called yellow journalism that was all about sensationalism and not so much the facts. So this is not anything new. And so let's be wise and let's control the amount of political information that we bring in. Let's look at the sources. Let's take things with a grain of salt, measure them according to Scripture, and protect our souls. So that's the first one. If you want to deal with political fatigue, then please control the political information. So if my thesis is correct, we're fatigued by political information and not political involvement. My second suggestion is to consider political involvement. All right. So take some of that time that, all right, we're doom scrolling, oh, the world is horrible, all right, well, if I'm concerned about where the nation is going, and believe me, I am, that's why I started the podcast. That's why we're doing everything we can legally and at the State House here in Indiana to build relationships, impact public life. Then let's take some of that energy, some of that angst, and let's funnel it into productive involvement. And I'll use the analogy of exercise. And I was fortunate kind of growing up. My parents really pushed sports. And I learned early on, like, man, I am so tired. And so I thought, hey, if I'm tired and I go work out, I'm actually going to be more tired. But you know that that's not true. If you go and you exercise, you actually feel better. And it gets those endorphins going. They talk about the runner's high. You feel like, all right, I've done the hardest thing that I'm going to do today. Now I can go tackle the rest of my to-do list. And so I think it's like that. If you're active, you feel better because, all right, I have limited ability, I have limited time, limited resources, but I'm doing everything I can, and then I can leave the results up to God rather than just sitting back and watching things happen and wringing my hands. So as we set out in the podcast before, my position, and if your conscience is different, I would defer to that. But according to my analysis of Scripture, political parties are a tool that we can use as Christian citizens, as long as they do not become an identity, as long as they are not something that we worship. They are a mission field, not home base. And we can work to bring biblical principles to bear in these political parties. And in the United States, we have two primary parties. that if you do not participate in them, you don't have much meaningful influence in American public life. Again, if your conscience is different, I leave it up to you. That to me is just a reality on the ground. And so that would mean, all right, I'm going to look at my zip code. I'm going to get involved. That means to get registered to vote. How about engaging in a campaign? Have you ever found a candidate that you trust, or maybe you feel led to run? I'll get to that in a second. Maybe you have a friend that wants to run for school board. Well, have you ever actually gotten involved in a campaign, knocked doors, talked to people about what they care about? And your children often, we know from data that your children will often pursue the same habits that you do. And so if you've never been involved in a campaign, you've never spoken out on issues. I'm here in Indianapolis, headed over to our state house here in just a few minutes, and just the House this year has had over 400 bills filed, and those bills that are going to move forward have a committee hearing. You could come up and testify in a committee hearing, or you could simply let your legislators know. A handwritten note does wonders. And are we engaging in those discussion, expressing an opinion about policy, rather than just keeping it all bottled up and arguing with somebody on X or on Facebook that doesn't do much? How about let's go to the people that are making these decisions and express your opinion? Or if you have a great idea for a bill that you think is going to help protect parental rights, help going to promote partnership between government and the faith community on things like foster care or mental health, well, then contact your legislator, build a relationship with them, and you can propose these sorts of things. And then certainly vote. And maybe God is calling you at some point. Maybe God's calling you to public square ministry, to get engaged, whether that's running as a rep or having more of a presence at your state house or in your local courthouse, city council chamber, etc. So that's another suggestion. All right, control the political information. You have a system for that. Run the play. All right, develop a system, run the play. Don't let your soul get overwhelmed by what's happening. Consider political involvement, kind of like exercise. All right, I'm going to go do this, and now I feel better because I'm trying. I'm doing everything I can with my season of life to make a difference, and that can help. The next thing is to commit to your zip code. And I have been beating this drum for a long time on the podcast because I tell you, national politics is like a bug zapper. And maybe parts of the United States, if you're listening around the world, we do have listeners in other places. Maybe you don't have these, but where I grew up in Midwestern United States in Arkansas, man, we had bugs. We had insects. Alabama as well. We had insects. And so they sell these things where it's designed to attract the insect to it through a light, and then it gets zapped with electricity. That is national politics. All right, the light. All right, people are fighting. All right, something's going on with Trump. Something's going on with Biden. Something's going on. It's this attention zapper in national politics. And again, stay informed. Contact your congressman, contact your congresswoman. But most of us are going to have our greatest impact in our own zip code. So it's easy to get overwhelmed by the scope and the size of politics. 331 plus million Americans and all that's going on. So the problem is most of us can get caught up doom scrolling, just paying attention to national politics, and we do nothing meaningful in the area that we have influence. So one stat that I enjoy pointing out to state officials in the state of Indiana is that the initial census, I believe it was 1790, of the United States, George Washington as president. In that census, there were 3.9 million Americans. And about 600,000 of those were slaves that did not have the opportunity to vote. So 3.9 million Americans, that is smaller by about half than the population of the state of Indiana, which is not exactly New York or California, okay? And yet we looked at George Washington, the father of the country, did amazing things. And I enjoy bringing that up to say, look, this is such a massive scale. And yet, how does the Church of Jesus Christ move forward? How do we make a difference? It's always through a local church first. All right. So the church itself is set up to be a local body of believers. And so I take a cue from that and say, look, most of us, not only, and this is not a flaw in the system, right? This is not a fault of ours that perhaps we do not have a national platform. I believe that's actually how God has created us, and that is his calling for many of us in our lives, and that we're going to have our greatest impact right within that 15 to 20 miles or more around your home. And if God blesses you with a bigger platform than that, then that's amazing. But that's where most of us should focus. And so the school board, the city county council, the problems in your town and in your city. And so go commit to your zip code. And if you're involved there, I do think that can help with political fatigue, because it isn't, you're going to track what's going on nationally, but you're trying to figure out how to help the homeless in your community, or how to win a school board election, or maybe become a state rep or a state senator. And then if God promotes you from there, great. But let us commit to our own zip codes first and see how that helps with the political fatigue and being able to do this long term. As I often will share with elected officials, that especially even at the state or national level, that they have stats, but pastors and local Christians, they have faces and they have names of people that they're making a difference in their lives. So that's another thing that you can think about. Number 4, I would say, is to check your role and calling. So I first was control political information, consider political involvement, commit to your zip code. I am a compulsive alliterator, so here's another C. Check your role and calling. This has to do with really spiritual formation, especially as a follower of Jesus. I do believe that the complexity of the world's need is met by the diversity of Christian calling. And so look at your life and what has God specifically called you to do in this time and in this season. And I think of the moms out there with little kids in the home, and that's going to be a really tough season to do a lot. Now, I'm so grateful for my family. They'll be coming up to the State House to minister with me a little bit later this spring. And so our family, we're trying, even though we got kids, they're at school, that sort of thing, we're trying to make a difference. And so I do think you think about your role, your calling, your season of life. I do believe that citizenship is not an option for us. Rather, it is a duty. And we've set out those justifications extensively on the podcast. Things like the Great Commission, which tells us to make disciples, not just converts. And so how do we equip other Christians? And how do we even ourselves understand what Scripture says about this other God-ordained institution and how we should interact with it? And especially in a participatory democracy here in the United States, that we are Caesar. And because we have authority, we have responsibility. We've also talked about the creation mandate. That's, I think, carried over into Jeremiah 29 to the exiles there, which is, it doesn't matter where we are citizens of a place. That as Christians, we're not just cosmopolitan. We should be kingdom-minded, but we are not cosmopolitan. God puts us in places, and we're supposed to develop roots. We are supposed to build, as Jeremiah 29 says, build houses. And they knew that they'd be leaving, but yet they built houses, they planted gardens, they made a difference. So for the Christian, this is not an option. And when you study your own calling, God may call some of us into public office. God calls some of us to be church leaders. God calls some of us to be business owners. And so how, in the place that God has put me, how can I most effectively impact my community in my role as citizen? I think, given my talents, my passions, my life experiences, my resources, how can I do that? And then you have to realize, and this is true about so many areas in the Christian life, we have to realize that we're not God. And wow, this is a hard one for us as American Christians. Well, at least it's hard for this American Christian to just admit, you know what, I can't be everywhere. I can't do everything. I have to be faithful to what God's called me to do. And then I've got to leave the rest up to Him. And so really leaning into checking your role and your calling. Now, some of us need to get out there and make a difference. And that's part of the reason I started this podcast. Hey, let's get out from behind the church's four walls, but let's be strategic about it. And so I do think coming back as you're considering 2024, checking your role, your calling. Am I doing what God's called me to do? If not, get out there and do it. Are you taking onto your shoulders the weight of the entire nation? That's not healthy, unless that's something that God's called you to. And that is something that I think about, because I do believe God's called me to it, to try to impact my state, to impact the country. And so I do wake up thinking about that. But I also have to realize that I can do what I can do, and I'm going to be strategic. But at the end of the day, God gives His servants rest. because ultimately he's in control. And that's why he gave us the Sabbath as a reminder. And so that part was just pretty much admonishing myself as well as any listeners that might find that helpful, because I need to remember that. I really do, to help with fatigue. The last one that I would say is to create generational change. Create generational change. So we started with controlling political information, considering political involvement, committing to your zip code, checking your role in calling, and again, just compulsive alliteration here, creating generational change. I've said this before on the podcast, but I want to emphasize it here again. The longer I'm in public life, the more I am convinced that the more progressive, those that side of things, those that do not share our biblical worldview, that they have been focused on generations while we have focused on elections. And what is going on right now is not something that occurred overnight. It is at least 100 to 150 years in the making. And even though we are to be kingdom minded and we should think long term, I mean, you think about scripture and how patient God is and how he's at work across continents and ages and generations. We sometimes thinking, all right, 2 years, 4 years, we're kind of a microwave generation. We got to get these things done. And those that have opposed the biblical worldview have just patiently worked to control institutions, to control messaging, to control culture, and they're playing the long game. And so we should do this the same, not because we are motivated by the same principles, but because that's what God calls us to do. That is what is wise. That is what's strategic. As I've talked to pastors about 2020, I think many of the Christians out there that became upset, left ministries, broke relationships over things, there was so much angst and anger and confusion about what's going on and what's happening to our country. And all of this is completely understandable. But I think part of that is that there was no good outlet. There was no, all right, here's the model of how Christians should engage in public life. And that's why even for church leaders, I encourage you to consider political involvement. Now you're gonna have to do that in your own way, considering your own conscience. But if there's no model of how to do this well, then people are just going to do it poorly. But then also, if there's no plan, all right, so how are we going to impact the United States? We've set this out in the book, The Good Citizen. I'm not going to fully set it out again here, but having a strategic plan of, let's have a good solid foundation biblically. Let's go pray for, build relationships with people. Let's be good community partners. And then it sets us up to do the hard work. And as I've shared before in the podcast, I'm invested in, at least for this season, in a state-based, church-led effort to renew America. I think that is the greatest opportunity for transformative change at this point. And God's going to call different Christians to different places. But let's have a plan. And so let's take that energy, that angst, and that concern that we should feel as believers, and let's channel that into something productive. So as we look down the road, we're saying, hey, where we have opportunity, let's get the church engaged. Let's think generationally. Let's train up the next generation. Let's get involved locally, and let's see that work out in the coming years. And we saw this. We should be encouraged because this worked in the life issue. Now, that we're just in a different chapter, and we're going to have to continue to fight this, but we were able to get it, something that was there for 50 years, Roe versus Wade, overturned due to the generational, some people didn't even live to see that happen, to the generational institution building, locally focused effort to build pregnancy care movements, care centers, impact the hearts and lives of our neighbors. And so let's be encouraged to create generational change. So I think what's happening is that a lot of American Christians are saying, you know what? I'm tired. I'm disappointed. So I'm going to quit. I'm tired. I'm disappointed. This is just too heavy for me to watch my nation crumble around me. So I'm just out. But I don't believe that's the biblical role that God has for us. The better approach is to say, I am tired. Absolutely. I'm fatigued by all this stuff, but this is important. So I'm not going to quit. Rather, I'm going to strengthen my disciplines. And I'm going to engage in public life in a biblical way with a strategic plan and for the glory of God. So again, so I'm tired, but this is important. So I'm going to strengthen my disciplines. And I'm going to engage in public life in a biblical way with a strategic plan for the glory of God. I believe that is how we fix political fatigue, certainly among American Christians, and how we can engage, we can reinvest to make a difference for the long term. This is not a sprint; it is a marathon, and so we should plan accordingly. And this is not something new to Christians. I mean, this is what we do in our spiritual lives. This is what we do when we build our local church. And so let's do that. Let's engage in public life in a biblical way with a strategic plan and for the glory of God. So those are 5 ways to fix political fatigue. The first one is to control political information. 2, consider political involvement. 3, commit to your zip code. 4, check your role and calling. And 5, create generational change. So let's be an example first of dealing with political fatigue, and then we can help others do the same. We'll see you here next week. By the way, if these episodes are encouraging to you, I sometimes forget to say this, and I need to. I would encourage you, please do rate us. Maybe share this episode with somebody you think would be encouraged by it. That helps us to be visible in iTunes and other podcast players. So thanks for tuning in. I'm looking forward to 2024 and the difference that we can make together.